And the Greeks figure, well, the revolution's all over nearby. We'll rise up too, which is exactly the wrong thing to do because they want to put you down, right? Nobody's going to accept your legitimacy. And indeed, all the European states renounce it. We have nothing to do with this. And they expect the Sultan to put it down, right? That leaves the Greeks by themselves. They thought they're going to be received as Europeans. They're asking to join the Holy Alliance. They think they stand for those principles, conservative principles. Some of them speak about constitutions and liberalism, but generally speaking, here we are, we're the Europeans, we're your origins, we're back, accept us.
Hello. On the 17th of March, 1821, the Greek Revolution began in the small town of Areopoli, which is part of the Mani Peninsula in the Peloponnese. An uprising against the Ottoman Empire was soon joined by many communities throughout the Peloponnese and Greece. Now, many Greeks would disagree with where it began, but the more important question is why. Joining today is historian Yanni Kotsonis, author of The Greek Revolution and the Violent Birth of Nationalism, as we discuss the revolution, what it meant for Greeks, for those in wider Europe, and what happened during 10 years of violence and how the revolution is viewed in Greece today. Plenty more history to come, so please do follow or subscribe, and if you can give a kind rating, I'll be hugely grateful. But in the meantime, it's me talking with Yanni Kotsonis on the Greek Revolution. Yanni, welcome to the podcast. A great pleasure to have you on. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Right. Well, we're here to talk about this new book that actually had been out for about a month, I think. The Greek Revolution and the Violent Birth of Nationalism. And I was absolutely very keen to speak to you the moment I received an email about it, because anything to do with Greece, I'm immediately interested in. I did study ancient history, which is why, and so I know, you're probably groaning and go, "Oh my God, another one of these Brits
It's
who's."
interesting. It's
Well,
interesting.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, it certainly is. It certainly is. But as a result, I'm absolutely fascinated by the Greek Revolution, and I wondered, probably helpful to start with, to just, okay, this is going to be a very difficult way of explaining it, but for listeners who aren't hugely familiar about the Greek Revolution, would you be able to kind of give a brief summary? Because, and the reason why I'm kind of smiling is it's not a hugely simple topic, is it?
No, no. And it's not a very well-known topic, right? So the in terms of why one would or would not know about it outside of Greece. There's not a lot of reason to know about it because it's been narrated as something very, very esoteric and almost sui generis, meaning it's our revolution. Now, that's what every national movement will say, and every national history will say. We're different and we're unique. Every country will cite its uniqueness going back to, well, in your case, I don't know, Magna Carta or 1688. You tell me. And so there's nothing unique about the Greeks. The Greeks are unique, I think, because they can claim a history, and not without cause, going back to ancient times, was at the very least classical. Some people go back to Minoan and Mycenaean. That's debatable, but certainly there's a recognizable alphabet and a recognizable lexicon going back to classical times. And so the easy thing to do is to draw a straight line. So most people, when they think of Greece, will think of ancient times. And so modern history is narrated as a linear continuation of what happened in ancient times. So we name our children Socrates and Plato and so on and so forth, right? And that keeps alive and it generates this notion that we're part of a lineage. There's a stop along the way in Byzantium and Christianization. How this tallies exactly with the 12 Olympian gods, well, that's another matter. But the line, according to this narrative, is straight, right? Now, this then brings us to the revolution. So there's a period of about 300 years when the area that we call Greece today is in Ottoman hands, right? It's the Ottoman regime. And so the usual narrative is that these Greeks, who had always been Greeks and had traveled more or less intact through time, arrive at this point in 1821 when they can't take it anymore. They're being oppressed. They're being stripped of their religious rights and so on and so forth. They are overthrown. The violence that ensues, and they'll recognize it as violent, takes the form of national formations fighting more or less in military fashion against each other, right? So it's kind of understood that, it's a war and there will be casualties. And at the end, they end up as a Christian kingdom made up of a Christian population, mainly Orthodox with some allowances for Catholics, but without the Muslims and without the Jews. So Greece becomes homogeneous. And to this day, anybody will tell you we're different than other countries because we are so homogeneous, 98 point something percent Orthodox, 100% Greek speaking, right? Now, it's not necessarily wrong, any of this, but for this to happen, something has to have happened, right? So the nation wasn't pre-existing. National consciousness is a new thing. A nation state is a new thing. And the first ethnic nation state is the Greek one. Comes about from a nationalist revolution. So it's interesting in that regard. The lineage is interesting, but more interesting is how this space, which was not at all a national space, becomes a national space. How did this come to happen? So what I'm doing is I'm taking issue with a certain standard of historiography, which we teach to children in school. I went to Greek school. I was taught this story. Now, after a while, okay, you're in, second grade, third grade, fifth grade, fine, right? You're given these more or less flat stories and linear accounts of heroism and whatnot. But then after that, we grow up, right? Well, we need to grow up. And we need to start saying, okay, it did produce something nice. And I do think it did produce something nice, meaning the Greek state and the Greek space I find to be an attractive one. And it's working through problems which are historical. Every country does do that and should do that. So taking it ass backward, in other words, what we're saying is, look at what we have today, but ask also where it came from and what are some legacies that we're still trying to work out. So, for example, do you need to be Orthodox to be Greek? Which is sort of the answer technically is no, but practically it's hard to get around the percentages, right? What do you do with a migrant who's come, a refugee, immigrant, and so on and so forth, who's Muslim, or Hindi for that matter? Where do they belong? How do they belong? What do you do with a different kind of immigrant who's Christian? Why do they enjoy a different experience? So these are questions which are still with us. And it was brought to a head with the migrant crisis of 2015, which is also the economic crisis in Greece. And that's another legacy of the revolution, the economic crisis, meaning the modern Greek state was born into debt. The modern Greek state was founded on debt from the three powers, Britain, France, and Russia. And it's never left that position of awkwardness, which is sometimes also outright subservience and domination. And the most recent chapter in that would be the debt crisis of 2015. That has a history. And it's born out of the revolution as well. So what I'm trying to do is not simply, yeah.
Sorry, that's so interesting that that you can trace the connection between the revolution and the financial crisis. That's really interesting. Is that because, just exploring that a little bit further, is that because Greece, as it's been founded in indebtedness and has remained so, and so more prone, it wasn't just poor choices made during the 2000s and entering the euro. It's part of the sort of financial economic psyche of Greece.
Yes, no, very much so, and it comes up periodically with major crises at certain points in time, beginning in the immediate post-revolutionary period, when they're indebted to these countries and they have debts also outstanding in the London's bond market. This continues all the way to the 1870s, erupts again in the 1890s, erupts again in the 1920s when Greece receives all these refugees and requires some kind of foreign assistance. And it leads to a certain kind of supervisorship coming from international organizations or the League of Nations. Then it comes up again, well, obviously in the Great Depression, but that affected everybody. And then the most recent one was post-financial crisis 2008, which in Europe and the Eurozone came to a climax in 2015. Now, the reason why I'm drawing this connection is it's not simply the fact of that, but Greece becomes this model and countermodel at the same time. The empire is going to start disintegrating. It's going to take another 150 years, but they're going to start disintegrating. The Ottoman Empire first, but then all of them. And these are still, great powers who are yielding these colonies. Um, and they're yielding them into a world in which they don't have that direct control anymore. It's no longer going to be gunboats, or it still will be, but over time it will stop being gunboats. So, how does a powerful, wealthy, hegemonic power exercise control but without the gunboats? Well, so the gunboats are always there, but mainly what it's doing is it's accessing it through finance capital. So Greece emerges into the new world as a nominally independent state with sovereignty. But it arrives with a debt that everybody knows it can't possibly repay. So for the other powers, this is leverage, and they're going to use it. The Russians will do it in the beginning, then the French and the British. Later on, it will be the Americans, and then most recently, it will be Germany and France and the EU and the Eurozone. So that's the form. That's how small and or poor states will be subordinated to a different kind of power. It's finance power, and the credits.
Okay. With Greece's ancient past, which, as you've already mentioned, is, I mean, just ever present throughout Greece. You
Yeah,
can't drive down a road without the brown archaeological sign for some sites.
yeah.
I mean, there's so many, which makes someone like me very happy. But um, is that knowledge of the past? And I noted in the book that you're from, or certainly your grandfather's from Laconia, which is known here as Sparta.
Mhm.
So that has a certain military influence, I'm sure, and a sense of independence. And I guess there's arguments as to where the revolution began, but Laconia can certainly make a strong argument that it began. I don't know, Areopoli have I fallen for the Mani tourist board?
Yeah, but I mean, every region claims to be the first, right? I mean, so the people from Kalamata right across the mountain range will say, no, it started there. We're a little further up. People from the area of Gastuni, we're the first ones to organize proper armies, and so on and so forth. But the truth is that they're all striving to show that they were first in the national struggle, and that's significant. And secondly, it does say that there was this movement which did overtake this entire population very suddenly. And the real question is why? Because it wasn't obvious, right?
Oh, so why?
Well, so this is partly a matter of the setting, which occupies a good part of the book, maybe about a third, maybe a bit more, which is the pre-revolutionary setting. What was the space before we had nations and before there was a formal Greece? Bearing in mind that there was no such thing ever of a geopolitical Greece. It had never existed before. We had notions of Greece, spirits of Greece, light of Greece, culture of Greece, and these things are very real. And I think modern Greeks are perfectly right to say, well, this was on our territory for the most part. All right, some of it was in Turkey, some of it was in Italy, but for the most part, this was our territory. We do practice a language and we have an alphabet which is comparable and has very direct roots. That's all fair. That's all fair. And we all claim things from our past. It's normal, right? So it's not unusual. Mind you, you could choose Athens instead of Sparta, and you're making a different kind of statement, right? And we do this all the time. Which ancient Greece are you choosing? So this space, then, by the time we get to around the year 1800 or so, most of the area that we call Greece is in the Ottoman Empire. Now, the only ones who called the Greeks Greek were foreigners. Greco in Italian, Grec in Russian, Greek in English, Grec in French, and so on and so on and so on. But the people who later became Greeks did not call themselves Greeks. They called themselves Romans, Romier. Why Romans? Because at the Ottoman conquest, the population there was still the Eastern Roman Empire. And they considered themselves to be the Romans, heirs to the Roman Empire, with the Caesar and everything. They're the Byzantine autocrat. And so they've been assimilated now into the Ottoman Empire as a population which is given recognition. And that recognition is that it's organized by confession, as a lot of the empires did in those days. The Russian Empire, the same, the Mongol Empire, the same. You're given recognition based on your confessional designation. And this gives you, first of all, recognition, tolerance, a right to exist, and protection. It gives you all of these things. This at least is how it was supposed to work in the Ottoman Empire. So the community of Orthodox Christians were called the Millet Irum, which means the community of the Romans, right? To this day, by the way, if you're speaking colloquially, you're traveling in Greece, or I'm traveling abroad even more so, I walk into a store, I hear this guy speaking with a certain accent, I say, hey, are you Roman? He said, Romios, right? To this day, right? It's a colloquial way of saying, are you Greek? But in those days, it didn't quite mean Greek. It meant you're a Orthodox subject of the Sultan. That's how it's supposed to work. And your neighbors are Muslims, your neighbors are Jews, mainly Muslims in all these territories. Your neighbors could be Roma of one or another religious designation. They could be Vlachs, but also Christians. They could be Turkish speakers and a very, very large number of Albanian speakers all the way up and down the Balkans. They are this traveling population of mercenaries, tinkerers, traders, and so on and so forth. So it's mixed, and it's supposed to provide tolerance for each of its supremacy, obviously, and predominance for or dominance for the Muslims. You could convert and rise in that hierarchy. It's encouraged but not required. But it's supposed to be pluralistic and tolerant. So the idea, in other words, that the Ottoman regime was systematically oppressing the Christians, which is part of the current narrative still, is simply wrong. Right? It was not the case. Churches were still being built, schools were being opened, language is being taught. In fact, the Greek language by this time is spreading all the way up to Russia in these trade routes, including the new lands of Russia, today's Ukraine, as these people who spoke a variety of languages adopted Greek as their language of business and administration. So it was actually expanding rather than declining. It's one of the main Ottoman languages, and certainly the main Ottoman language of the Balkans, all the way into Russia. The administration in these areas very often, like Ali Pasha of Yanina, famously, himself obviously a Muslim, he spoke Greek and he wrote Greek. His administration was conducted in Greek. I've seen his correspondence with his children, and it's in Greek. So there's no problem here with language, and there's no problem here with religion. That's not the issue. The problem was different. The problem was that the Ottoman Empire was decentralizing in a chaotic way. The central state under the Sultan and the port, in other words, in Constantinople, Istanbul, had lost its control over its different territories. And it was trying, however it could, to recoup some of its losses, and especially its revenues. It couldn't raise money. It was that simple. And it couldn't mobilize men. There's no system of conscription. The standing army is declining and disappearing. We're talking about the Janissaries. They won't fight anymore. They enjoy privileges but don't give anything in return. The landowners, all the way up the Balkans, which is the area that concerns us, the landowners are feeding off of the peasantry, and with a healthy appetite, mind you, in quite some brutal ways, feeding off the peasantry, but not sharing the revenues with the Sultan. So this makes it so that the Sultan would intermittently intervene and try to force somebody to give something. But since he doesn't have his own power, he uses his neighbors against him. So it becomes neighbor against neighbor, coalition against coalition, clan against clan, that kind of thing. So it's a state of more or less regular violence. You could even call it like, a multitude of mini civil wars throughout the region. Ali Pasha was only the biggest one when he broke with the Sultan. It's happening everywhere and always. Now, the interesting part is that this axis of confrontation, so the violence is ubiquitous, in other words. So if you're a Christian landowning administrator, a lot of the administrators here are Christians, exploiting the Christian peasantry. If you're one of these administrators and landowners, if you lose in a confrontation with your neighbor and the Sultan intervenes on behalf of your neighbor, you're going to lose your head, literally. I mean, they're going to cut off your head and it will be sent as a trophy to the Sultan or to the local Pasha or Bey, as the case may be. It's a dangerous game, in other words. And what they keep talking about in the sources is not, we're being oppressed, not we're being, our heritage is being erased. That's not what they talk about. They keep saying it over and over. A lack of security, right? You can't guarantee what you had promised us, which is peace, right? And tolerance, and so you say you're tolerant, But here I am constantly at civil war with with the neighboring clans. This axis of confrontation and this violence doesn't center around your religion or your language, right? It centers around your clan relationships and your alliances. So on the one hand, you had a clan of Christians allied with a clan of Muslims who then confront another clan of Christians and Muslims, and they fight each other, right? So it's not confessional, certainly not national. So this is the situation. This is what they're dealing with. A general breakdown. The narrative of oppression, of national oppression, religious oppression, linguistic oppression, will come later. It's added on, right? Partly to satisfy European sensibilities, Christians, right?
Is that
European
also, sorry to interrupt, is that also to partly satisfy European, particularly British and French admiration of ancient Greece and wanting to return Greece to its sort of... There is always this fascination of Greece, isn't there?
There is. So
I mean, all the British politicians were classics graduates from Oxbridge.
They were, and some of them were like huge Philhellenes, right? Although they didn't quite put a lot in with the Greeks until quite late in the game. But yes, they were. And anyone who had any education knew something about classical Greece, something. Many of them had done their European tours, right? They would do after, uni or something like that. They go on this tour, visit the sites, write travelogues, there's a plethora of these in all the European languages.
And Byron.
Byron would be the example, right? But they're all doing this. So it is that, what the Greeks call the worship of the ancients. But there's something else going on because this movement that comes out to support through civil society the Greeks, we're not standing so much on the ancient foundations, although they did that as well. They made it into a cause célèbre about Christianity, Muslims slaughtering Christians. And it becomes, as they put it themselves, a religious crusade. So part of the reason for this is because they couldn't unify all the Philhellenes under the banner of classical Greece, particularly not the religious groups, the Anglicans, the Catholics, and so on and so forth, who are saying, well, we're not here to defend pagans, right? There is only one God, right? And he's Christian. And there is some ambiguity because these are Orthodox and therefore schismatic, but nevertheless, they're Christians. And so the iconography, the paintings, look at Delacroix and look at all these people, these famous works of art tend to celebrate more the religious aspect. And this can unify conservatives, liberals, all the political spectrum, and ultimately governments as well. So that becomes the foundation. So then we're back to the situation, circa 1800. The Rum, meaning the ones who are in the Ottoman Empire, are in this situation. They're actually prospering, right? If they don't get their heads cut off, they do very well. Even if they do get their heads cut off, their children will inherit the privileges and the lands. A lot of them are doing very well with trade, extremely well. By now, the Greeks have taken over the Eastern Mediterranean trade. By Greeks, we mean now Orthodox, who tended to speak, well, Romaic Greek, right, modern Greek, but could also speak Albanian at home. They could also speak Vlach at home, Roma at home, Gypsy. But they're all coming together as a sort of the Greeks in the Mediterranean, on ships in particular. And they're acquiring some sort of, let's call it identity, right? Some sort of sense of community and of a shared culture. They begin to talk about more their shared religion. And they do go back to the classics. They begin to pay big money, because they do have a lot of money, these merchants, for the publication and transcription of the ancient texts or religious texts. They begin to open schools. And the epicenter of all this, where the big money is and where this national, they call it awakening or reawakening, let's just call it the creation of a national consciousness, the epicenter is in the north coast of the Black Sea, meaning the Russian Empire. Recently conquered by Catherine the Great, and she, lacking personnel, invites all populations to come and settle the land and later on to carry out the trade. Because Russia now begins to realize that their main export can be and will be grain. They become the largest exporter of grain to Europe in a very short period of time. They burn down the steppe and they turn it into farmland. The Greeks are the ones very often growing this wheat. The variety of wheat that they bring is actually directly from Corfu in this case, is that variety of wheat. And they do stupendously well. They fly the Russian flag or the British flag or whatever it is that they pay a patent for, right? And they begin to take over the trade, and they do. So Mediterranean trade is Greek trade.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99, that's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show.
Now, they're not very daring, these people. They're doing very well by the empires, including the Ottoman Empire, so long as they don't lose their heads, right? But they're doing very well. They're doing very well. And they're going back and forth from the Russian lands, the new Russian lands, like Odessa, Taganrog, and going out of the Black Sea and into the Aegean and then into the broader Mediterranean, bringing goods back and forth, mainly Russian grain, which is their main source of wealth, into the European countries and to the North African coast, and manufacturers and semi-manufacturers being brought back. Right? And they're doing stupendously well. And they're paying for this awakening, right? If you want to call it that. Big money, big money. And the first glimmers that there's something subversive about this. So you have to understand also, the more they read about the origins of Christianity in Byzantium, the first Christian empire, the more they read about the ancient Greeks, the more they become convinced that they're special. Well, like any nationalist, right? But they think that they have more cause. After all, who else can claim Leonidas, right? Who else can claim Plato? Who else can claim Constantine the Great, right? Who else could build Hagia Sophia, and so on and so forth? And so they have a really outsized sense of themselves, backed by a lot of money, right? And when the first glimmers of subversion come up, meaning not only are we Greeks, and they begin to adopt the terminology, and they're not sure what words to use yet. The Greek word for a Greek today is Hellene, right? Hellenos. That's not the word they use. That refers to the ancients. They try, Romans, but that's it doesn't encompass everybody. What do you do if you're in Russia? You're not Ottoman, right? What if you're in Italy or in Marseille? You're not Ottoman. So they use Greki, which is a special term for those who are not in the Ottoman Empire. Greki. Christians sometimes, or just the region they come from, right? But little by little, they begin to adopt the same terms, so that the Greeks who had come from the west coast of the Peloponnese, the east coast of the Peloponnese, who had actually nothing to do with each other. I mean, they wouldn't spend 5 days of travel just to reach one another, right? Or the ones from the Ionian Islands, which at this point are Venetian, turning into French, later the Russians, later the British, and that lasts much longer. What do we call them? They're not Ottomans, right? They're if anything, they're Westerners, they're Franks, they're foreigners. They speak a different dialect. But once they start going on these trade routes, they're adopting the same dialect, using the same alphabet. Even if at home they spoke Albanian or the local dialect or something like that. And it's here, outside of the areas that become Greece, that they begin to form this sense of shared identity and ultimately a sense of national belonging, right? That's where it happens, mainly in Russia, backed by a lot of money from wheat, right? That's where it happens. So the first conspiracy happens in 1814, not the first one, but the main conspiracy about, we're going to push for a Greek revolution, takes place among some merchants in Odessa, right, in Russia. Not in the Peloponnese, not in Athens, not the Ionian Islands, Odessa, right? And that's where it starts. And this is still kind of an alien idea for most others who spoke Greek. Yes, we speak the language. Yes, we travel the same routes. Yes, we go to the same churches and we listen to the same liturgy. But in Asia, the empires are good to us. What smart merchant would say, I'm going to give up the Russian Empire to acquire some stones in the Aegean Sea, right? Why on earth would I do something like that? They go back and forth. They bring money back and forth, but they're doing okay, right? So for most people, these guys are a little crazy, right? And that's where we are. And so what is it to be a Greek in these times? Self-designated or designated by others. And there's stories that are recounted in the book of all the different routes they were following. There's so many different possibilities. Most of them, even after Greek independence, stay in the empires. The largest part of them stay in the Ottoman Empire, and they continue to be the Romans, right? Others end up as French citizens. Others end up as British citizens in the Ionian Islands. In many cases, they don't know what to do with them even. So, some of them volunteer for the French forces. The French don't know what to do with them because they're sort of us, but not. They're sort of European, but not. They're sort of Christian, but not our Christianity. They speak French, but barely. They've recruited them all over this area for the Napoleonic Wars. So they call them people of color, meaning what others would call mulattoes, right? And put them in regiments of black troops. Well, why not? And the Greeks themselves didn't mind. As long as they're Christian, they're okay with it, right? So you have these kinds of stories, which looking back, you say, well, this is random. Who would take a Greek European cradle civilization and put in a regiment of Africans, mainly from Haiti, and the Haitians? And they say, well, why wouldn't you, right? I mean, there's nothing saying that we have to belong to this group in this place on that particular rock, right? Anyway, so that's where we are, right? There's nothing telling us that there should be a Greek nation yet, and nothing telling us that it has to occur in this place, right? Meaning what today would look like the map of Greece.
Yeah, where does the border start? Where does it end? Yeah.
Well, I mean, Greece was wherever Greek speakers happened to be, or the Orthodox happened to be. And if you look at maps, they're everywhere, right? From Moscow to St. Petersburg, London, Marseille, Paris, Livorno, which was a big financial and merchant center at the time, Brindisi, you name it, Alexandria, Egypt, those were the Greeks. And, to abandon these empires in favor of a nation, it made no sense. It wasn't really on anyone's mind yet, right? And then something has to change, right? Something has to change, right, to make this happen. And as I said, it was not written in stone, so to speak, right? Something has to happen. And so here, there's a sort of, historians can speak about conjunctures. Things come together in a certain way and create a certain reality. And that conjuncture will create this event, which is the Greek Revolution, right? Meaning there's a confluence of different things going on, which come together at one point to create this event, the Greek Revolution, which happens in early 1821. Part of it is these crazy people running around saying that we're going to be a Greek nation, right? And remember, at that point, they were crazy. The world hasn't shifted to them yet. The world will shift to them. But at this moment, it doesn't. They don't have a big membership. Those who joined that, but they also joined the Freemasons. They joined other religious organizations. That was one of many options, And it wasn't clear that they're joining because they want to carry out a revolution. They're anti-Muslim, for sure. They call all Muslims Turks.
And there's a lot of score settling, isn't there?
In what?
As in killing of evicting Muslims and killing of them.
You mean after the revolution breaks out?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's what the revolution becomes in the end.
Yes,
in the end, that's what it becomes.
Hence the violent birth of nationalism,
right?
In the title of your book.
Yeah, so putting aside the details, in other words, of how this comes to pass, just to say, in other words, it's not expected, right? Nobody expects this. What had happened was there had been a series of revolutions in the Mediterranean against the old regimes and against the reaction of Vienna. There was a revolution in Spain, which the French put down. There were two revolutions in Italy, in Piedmont and in Napoli, which the Austrians put down. And the Greeks figure, well, the revolution's all over nearby, we'll rise up too, which is exactly the wrong thing to do because they want to put you down, right? Nobody's going to accept your legitimacy. And indeed, all the European states renounce it, right? It's sort of, we have nothing to do with this. And they expect the Sultan to put it down, right? That leaves the Greeks by themselves. They thought they're going to be received as Europeans. They're asking to join the Holy Alliance. They think they stand for those principles, conservative principles. Some of them speak about constitutions and liberalism, but generally speaking, here we are, we're the Europeans, we're your origins, we're back, accept us. And that's the last thing they want to do. This is overturning the old order. And even the Sultan, we don't like him, but he is still legitimate, right? So they wait for the Sultan to do his job. But what allowed this revolution to break out, which is the lack of resources and mobilizational capacity, then make it almost impossible for the Sultan to then put it down. Right? So if you're this population, which now for the first time begins to proclaim that they are Hellenes, right, as the Greeks will designate themselves, and were united, okay, some of them are peasants who have been oppressed by their Greek landlords or Christian landlords. But we'll put that aside for now and focus on the Muslim landlords. So we form an alliance of the poor peasantry, the landlords and the merchants. And rather than cause a civil war among ourselves, we're going to turn our attentions to the external enemy, which is the Muslims, right? That's sort of a tacit agreement. And everyone agrees that if we have this common enemy, then we won't fight among ourselves yet, right? And this is what they do. So all of this population is now mobilized in a new way, and this hasn't happened before. It's a mass mobilization of all the Christian population, peasants, merchants, sailors, landowners, money lenders, all of them, priests to some extent. And they're all marching now on that neighbor next to you. I mean, not some distant foreign, the neighbor next to you, who also speaks Greek, by the way. The neighbor next to you, whom you shared holidays with.
Yes, you write about the village in Laconia that is now deserted.
That's right. So these were all mixed places. Some of them had more Muslims, some had more Christians, but you would see each other nearby and you would celebrate holidays together. Muslims would often recognize Christian saints, right, and vice versa. And you buy each other drinks, you buy each other coffee, you visit each other, and so on and so forth. And now in these new conditions, suddenly your neighbors become your mortal enemy. So they go in and they basically round them up, right? It begins with massacres, village by village, household by household. It continues with populations fleeing to the port areas. Some of them make it onto ships and leave. And we say, well, they're going home to Turkey. So, well, no, their home was actually here, right? They've been here for 300 years, right? Some of them convert, become Christians, and therefore they become untouchable, right? Some of them become slaves. They're enslaved by the Greeks as well. That's how warfare was done here. The booty, part of the booty of a battle is the person, right? And then, but a lot of them die, and then that's it. So by the time we get to the end of 1922, meaning a year plus into the revolution, there are no more Muslims. They're just gone, completely gone.
That fast?
Yes, that fast. For it to happen so fast, you have to understand it's a mass movement, right? It's not armies occupying territories, neighbor against neighbor, peasant against peasant, notable against notable, and it's molecular, right? And it's total. It's all encompassing. And so this new understanding of total belonging, like the total Greek versus the total Turk, who's probably actually Albanian in most cases, but there you have it, produces a total violence and leave to completely remove an entire population. Which is why I think that the main way to understand the Greek Revolution is not the overthrow of a regime. Many of the aspects of the regime remained. The tax farming system, the exploitation, land ownership systems, a lot of these things continued for some decades after that. Really, the revolution is a demographic revolution, the removal of a population, right?
And it certainly shouldn't be viewed, I guess, that we fall prone to probably in this country with the involvement of Lord Byron as some kind of romantic conflict.
Well, there is romanticism. And Byron is a part of that. And there's romanticism in the way that Greeks will remember it, which is to say that, there were battles. There was a cause. It took them a while to figure out what the cause was. Would it be a constitution? Would it be a nation? Would it be, what exactly we're looking for? But by the end of it, there is a cause. Romantic in the capital R sense, meaning a literary tradition, an aesthetic. But do I look back at it romantically? The best I can say is that it evolved into something very good. I look at modern Greece and I say, I'm happy with it, and I'm glad the way it's evolving, right? In a secular fashion, meaning overall in the general direction. But the actual battles, so if you read the history books, most of them, and if you read the, what we're taught in school and still taught in school, Well, they're making it seem as if, the Muslims were foreigners, which they weren't. They had been there for 3 centuries, right? Muslims are foreigners. The Muslims are Turks, which they weren't. They were believers of various languages. Um, and that these were just battles of two opponents, and one of them lost and one of them won. That's not what happened. That's not what happened. This was, wholesale violence practiced by one total category against another total category. And it was unprecedented because it took a national form. There had been total wars. Napoleon practiced total warfare um, of one kind of army against another kind of army. He practiced it in the Vendée, famously. He practiced it then across Europe. To some extent, he practiced it on Haiti when he tried to reoccupy the island, which led to almost a war of extermination along racial lines. But this one was national. This one was national. And so what they created, in other words, which had not existed before, through the violence and through the experience of violence, they arrive at this notion of a total belonging in contradistinction to other people's total belonging. And very often zero sum. Only one person could remain here. Only one group can remain here. Now, for the Europeans, this was kind of weird. And for the Ottomans, especially, this was weird. So the Ottomans react with mystification.
Yes, they don't know what this Hellene is. Yes.
No, no. I mean, they're translating it into Yunan, which means Ionian, meaning the Greeks of the Anatolian coast. That's what they
Got
called
it.
ancient
Who
Greeks.
spoke Ionic Greek in the
Yes,
ancient
exactly.
time, yeah.
So Ionian Yunan, right? In Turkish. And so they said these guys are crazy. I mean, there haven't been Ionians here for 1,000 years. What are they talking about, right? Um, they're laughing and also mystified. They couldn't understand, those who were being captured and besieged. They couldn't understand, well, who are you exactly? Which empire do you represent? So we don't represent an empire. No empire is backing us. We represent ourselves. Well, who are you? Well, we're the Hellenes. The Hellenes are dead. Who are you? They said, well, we're the ones who've lived here for centuries. Oh, so we are too. So we're Greeks, right? They said, no, you're Muslims. Yeah. So what's the difference? I don't understand. They said, well, we have a different religion. They said, why don't you convert to Islam and we'll all be brothers? Well, they weren't getting it. They weren't getting it. They weren't understanding. It's tragicomic in a sense, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, it is extraordinary. I know we're sort of running out of time, but I'm very interested in um, how modern Greece deals with the revolution. Then, does it view it as the way you've described it, or is it a slightly more? Because you can go to museums in Athens. I remember going to the National Army Museum, which was
Yeah.
quite a that was quite an unusual experience for me actually. It was quite jingoistic, I have to say.
Yes.
Very entertaining, but jingoistic, undoubtedly.
Mm.
So does that kind of translate over into it was this sort of benign national movement?
Yeah. And the violence explained and justified by the idea of justice, right? There was a justness to this. Um, this is very much how it's narrated. Now, my colleagues in Greece, so I'm in a special position. So I'm Greek, but I'm outside of Greece. I don't depend on colleagues, institutions, or anything like that. So, in fact, my colleagues here say, well, what's the problem? And we all criticize our nations, right? They don't understand where this could be problematic. Um, but if you're in Greece, you're telling these stories, right? I can think of a book which tells a different story. They're not stupid. On the contrary, many of them are very, very bright. And I can name you a few who are just very good. Unfortunately, most of them are dead now. But a lot of younger scholars also who can see, they pick up a little detail and they say, this is not what we were told. They say, this is not how it happened. And they begin to challenge some of the detail. But they don't go the next step of reassessing what it all means when you put it together. You've taken it apart. What form will it take now? What's your story? What's your driving narrative? What's your theme? What's your thesis? That hasn't happened yet. I thought it was happening, but by the time we get to the 200-year anniversary in 2021, I thought, and I was involved with a lot of these historians who are trying to set up a way of celebrating it with a sense of intelligent doubt, nuance, a sort of quizzical attitude for the sources and the narratives. But then the government changed, and the new government declared that no, it's going to be our usual celebration, and so that was that, right? So that's kind of disappointing. But there are a lot of historians who in Greece who know, right? The question is to how do you get it into the public realm?
That's a challenge, I suppose. Just one other question, actually, I have to ask you because this kind of there's a bit of a parallel thing going on here with the Parthenon marbles. Okay,
Mhm.
so and obviously, I guess this doesn't have a huge amount to do with the revolution, but with the Parthenon marbles, there's obviously a movement of which I am an enthusiastic member of, wanting to return the marbles to Athens. Okay.
Mhm.
Um, Now, the argument, which I don't necessarily subscribe to, but the argument being, the British Empire stole the marbles and, took them back to London in a terrible imperialist move. And then returning the marbles to their natural home, Greece, they are Greek, you know. Uh, that's a sort of it's also a rather ahistorical way of looking at the marbles. So is it two ahistorical groups arguing with each other,
Yeah, it's a very nice way of putting it.
and then really we should just I don't know what is that. What's your view on where the marbles should
Right. So there's the
go?
legal argument that a lot of people like to pursue. So the legal argument go like this: the argument in favor of keeping them in London, aside from the fact that they built a whole museum around them. What are you going to do if you take them away, right? Um, the British Museum was built to accommodate that, right? And so
So we've got two museums
Elgin,
built to accommodate marbles.
yes, one of them half empty, right? But the or full of plaster. Right? So so Elgin. Um, I mean, imperialist, I don't know what to say at that particular moment. Right? At that particular moment, it's an empire dealing with an empire. The British are extremely wealthy. They have a lot of gold. They have a lot of clout. The Ottomans respected that and dealt with the British. And according to one interpretation, Elgin came into agreement with the local authorities in order to take the marbles out, right? So he had permission. It's not my problem that the Sultan is not part of the negotiation, that you guys are so decentralized, you allow a local authority to do it, but a local authority allowed us to do it. The counter argument, which is again technically legal, is that we can't find any document. There's no document saying that he had the right to do this. And without that document, the British don't have the right to keep them, right? That's another argument. I think, that's missing the point. Both of those arguments are missing the point, right? Um, because, you could say also, look, people have always acquired artifacts from other countries. And yes, partly it's through conquest, the rights of war. Partly it's by some sort of agreement locally. I gave you these beads and you gave me this totem pole or something like that. And so, we can go on and on about this. But you take a step back and you say, okay, um, I enjoy going to London, walking into a free museum, um, walking around and seeing fantastically interesting things that I can't find anywhere else. It's always an experience for me, including the Elgin marbles, the Rosetta Stone, you name it, right? And on the other hand, I walk into Athens and I walk into the Acropolis Museum and I climb on the Acropolis, which I won't do anymore because it's too crowded. But the last time I was there was during COVID lockdown. It was fantastically nice, right? And I say, yeah, do we have a national claim to them? Well, it depends how far back you take your nation, right? Do they belong here? Yeah, aesthetically, they belong here. They were made for this space, not that space. Um, so on balance, I would say, yeah, they should be in Athens. They should be in Athens. Um, but the way the argument usually goes is that when there's some kind of crisis in Greek politics or even in British politics, and it's a good time to distract attention, let's talk about the marbles again, right? And this is a game. Cameron played it with the prime minister. The Boris played it with Mitsotakis. Mitsotakis brings it up every once in a while. When in doubt, either go after a national minority or a gender minority, or talk about the marbles, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. But look,
Are you with me
Yanni,
on this?
oh yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Yanni,
Yeah.
politicians, I think, yes, when they're getting involved in certainly cultural issues, then you have to be extremely suspicious.
Hmm.
But Yanni, this has been really fantastic, absolutely fascinating stuff. Thank you so much. Links are in the show notes to the Greek Revolution, the violent birth of nationalism. Listeners, it's available now. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Enjoy the conversation.
Thanks very much for listening. The next episode sees comedian and actress Helen Lederer join to discuss her fascinating family history and her comedy career during the 1980s when she worked with legends such as Rick Mayall. But until then, thank you and good night.